Thank you. Thanks for having me. That was a perfect setup for my presentation. So it's a bit paradoxical how to fight for light when climate research points to the importance of high-density, compact, transit-friendly, efficient urban districts. We know that poorly designed urban districts are essentially concrete jungles. So we feel that 21st century urban design must configure these districts. These are compact, high-density districts, which have problematic issues with respect to light and air, but to design them to reduce the impact of heat and flooding, and to essentially enhance high-quality, low-carbon lifestyles with ample access to light and air. So, there we go. Oop. So research has shown that the importance of, let me just put it back here, sorry, okay. Research has shown the importance of integrating climate adaptation, which is around urban heat island, and climate mitigation, which is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists have shown the importance of this through the publication recently of a book, Climate Change in Cities, which is downloadable, and I urge you to download it. And in this particular publication, for the first time, architects, urban designers were working closely with climate scientists. And so the question was, how does urban planning and urban design intersect with climate science? And so chapter 5, which I was coordinating lead author, provides a sort of blueprint of how to configure sustainable and climate resilient urban districts. And the next slide shows, of course, the projections of extreme heat in the New York case study, which is quite alarming, and the impact on public health, which we've talked about earlier, but I'm sure we'll talk about more. And we're leading to heat-related, increase of heat-related deaths in New York City. So high-density cities, which is good, right? High-density cities is desirable from the point of view of efficiency and from the point of view of climate mitigation, right? Lowering greenhouse gas emissions. But these compact urban form essentially is in contrast to low-density areas, which contribute disproportionately to climate change. And so the image that you see here with population density shows high-density urban districts, but those same urban districts amplify climate change impacts, is what I've talked about, in terms of increasing concentration of people, the assets that these cities have with respect to transportation, traffic, emissions, anthropogenic emissions from human-caused emissions, and the kind of economic activities leading to increase of heat and flood in these areas. So cities are our challenge, but are also our solution. Now you might ask, if high-density cities are essentially problematic with respect to urban heat and flooding, why not just simply create lower density regions? Essentially, lower density regions are spread out, people have access to a lot more trees, sunlight, that sort of thing. It is true that at a very granular level, these lower density regions essentially are more comfortable when you're looking at a backyard, for example, of your suburban home and you've got a lot of trees, et cetera. But taken together over the entire region, the inefficiencies of this particular suburban sprawl lead, of course, to, as we know, a lot more reliance on automobiles, a lot more pavement, a lot more parking lots, that sort of thing, and of course have a negative impact with respect to habitat and spaces that are natural spaces, which are also carbon sinks. So the importance is then to look at from a regional perspective, the importance of compaction, these compact urban centers, but then to deal with the sort of human comfort at the street level, which was described very well in that video that you just saw. Local climate zones have been mapped out by urban climatologists, and I think it was sort of an epiphany for me when I was in urban climatologist conferences with scientists, et cetera, and they were just showing these very compelling images of three-dimensional urban form, and I thought to myself, well, that's what we do as urban designers. We need to have more of a conversation with these climate scientists. So again, at the micro scale and the local scale, that's where the battle is being waged. And I think that that's really an important point from the point of view of this conference. So how do we set up a sort of relationship between the climate adaptation and the climate mitigation? Again, climate adaptation, urban heat island, and flooding, right? So you could see the slide in front of you. At the top has an urban heat island, land surface temperature from satellite photos showing heat in this case, Gowanus, Brooklyn. And at the bottom are a series of circles which show essentially the carbon footprint of that same district. And of course, districts grow, population density increases, and there's been a rezoning, for those of you who know, of this particular district, and they're envisioning more people coming. So we have a present-day solution, present-day condition, which is the one on the left, a business-as-usual scenario in the center, which shows basically if you don't do certain things, if you sort of do things the way the development occurs, the way typical development occurs in New York City, you're going to have a much more problematic situation on your hands. And then a best practice on the right-hand side, which shows essentially a zero-carbon development prototype, which is not only reducing the carbon footprint per capita of citizens, but also essentially flatlining the urban heat island effect of the district. So that's the sort of challenge, and it's very important to link the two from a value proposition perspective with respect to climate adaptation and climate mitigation, because oftentimes those two are bifurcated. They're separate from a funding point of view, from a governmental point of view, from a regulatory point of view. And I think it's really important. The research bears out that this is important, that the two are linked. So, how to frame this from a sort of let's say, design guidelines point of view. It's really important to convey some sort of key principles in ways that are pretty easy to understand from the perspective of architects, designers, urban designers, that sort of thing, and also the public. So I created a sort of decision-making framework where we have 4 urban climate factors, which are divided into form and function. The urban function, which is the upper left one, is essentially efficiency of urban systems, reducing waste heat and greenhouse gas emissions through energy efficiency, transit access, and walkability. Now notice, it's quite compact. It's around transit. So you're looking at a potential problematic situation with respect to access to light and air. The second box shows an urban form, where essentially modifying the form and layout of buildings and districts is the driver here. And notice the importance of sunlight and urban ventilation as a driver for this particular one. And this is where the urban design plays an important role. We must absolutely design our districts to maximize urban ventilation and access to sunlight in the wintertime as well. The other two, there's heat-resistant construction material, and then vegetative cover, which is essentially a proxy also for access to light, because vegetative cover, green infrastructure, and light are very much intertwined. And then from this, we develop a series of tools and units of measurement that are useful for the design community to start making decisions and actions with respect to these 4 urban climate factors. And then develop a set of steps, if you will, to actually bridge between the climate science and the climate practice. So we do a series of climate analysis mapping from land surface temperature, and then we identify the hot spots in a particular urban district. We then go down into the urban district, engage with the public, talk to them about where their priority areas are. So there could be 2 hotspots in an urban district, just for the sake of discussion. One is in front of a school, and the other is in a freight unloading area. Well, we would focus on the school as a planning and urban design intervention, which is step 3. And then we have a post-intervention evaluation, which is step 4. So, how to make this climate science actionable in projects? Well, we've developed a series of urban design climate workshops where we integrate climate science and urban design. And this is an image of a gathering at my university, New York Institute of Technology, where we bring in global climate scientists, global experts, who are sitting on the left side of the table, and on the right side of the table are urban designers here in New York City. And we are gathered around a model of Sunnyside Yard project that my students did, and we exchanged terms that we use and kind of issues, drivers of the kind of work that we do together. And you notice this word map in the middle showing the bigger letters are ones that are repeated between the different experts from across the table. So public realm, green cover, shading, equity, morphology, things of that nature are terms that are shared between the 2 groups. And these urban design climate workshops then is a model for the kind of work that I've been doing for the last few years, where we bring teams of climate scientists, urban designers, engineers together to actually work on projects, prototype projects. So we worked in Paris, New York, Morocco, Naples, Italy, and Durban, South Africa, just very recently. And we're going to continue this kind of methodology of bringing this sort of integrated approach to really bridge between the science and the action, the climate science and the climate action. So a typical sort of setup would be, this happens to be, as you New Yorkers know, is Sunnyside Yard, Queens. And we developed a sort of baseline 2050 sort of business as usual, showing hypothetical scenarios based on sort of typical market-driven decisions. And then we had our students and urban experts and climatologists develop a best practice 2050 based on climate adaptive development, considering the 4 climate factors that I described earlier. We did one in Paris as well during COP21, where obviously Paris is very sensitive to this issue with respect to public health because of this 2003 heat wave that they had, which killed a lot of people. And here it just shows a kind of a land surface temperature map of Paris showing hotspots. And you can tell from the hotspots what the land use is. So you've got parking lots that are in red, and in this case, this kind of blue area is the biggest park in Paris, the Bois de Boulogne. And so Paris is doing quite a lot of work on covering rail tracks, so kind of like Sunnyside Yards project, but actually they're doing it. And in this particular case, this is in the 17th arrondissement, just north of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris. And we covered a bit of that Gare Saint-Lazare, the railroad tracks here, with a high density insertion into this particular district to then test out what sort of best practice approaches might yield in terms of climate performance. And to do that, we developed sort of a morphological catalog, three-dimensional form catalog of urban forms, looking at solar and ventilation impacts, and sort of before and after scenarios. We also developed a series of sort of street section principles with respect to daytime microclimate. And of course, Paris has a diurnal effect also, so daytime and nighttime temperatures difference. So what are the sort of nighttime temperatures as well, and what were the street sections that speak to those different scenarios. And then we tested out what the outcomes of this using this land surface temperature from before and after. Did a project in northern Vietnam, also kind of more of using some of the design guidelines that I just talked about from the urban climate factors, where we aligned the linear park system in this provincial capital along the prevailing winds, summertime prevailing winds, and we set the city back also from the waterfront to allow for flooding to occur, and developed a series of parks that would have these sustainable urban drainage systems that would sort of capture the stormwater during the flood periods that became sort of amenities for those neighborhoods. And I think this is just a diagram that I drew, but it shows, I think I want to just talk about this for a minute with respect to urban heat, air quality, access to light, that sort of thing. It's important when we talk about the work that we're doing from a policy perspective in New York with respect to regulating low carbon building development. So it's great. We have regulations that are coming on which are really raising the bar on low carbon buildings. But those buildings sit within a particular district. So if the district is heating up between now and 2050, as I showed earlier, those low carbon buildings are going to be operating mechanical systems in a much more hostile environment in the future than they are now. So, first of all, how does that building code reflect that change, number one? And number two is, wouldn't it be easier, the bar would be lower, the challenge less extreme if we looked at a district level approach to lowering temperatures and enhancing comfort, because those buildings are sitting within that particular context. So it's important to kind of cut across different jurisdictional and spatial scales. Of course, the district is kind of like an orphan because there's no sort of governing body at a district scale that's easy to understand. It's either sort of at a city scale or at a building scale, whatever. Districts are a little bit more problematic. But I think it's an important spatial scale in which to address these kinds of questions. And so we spent a lot of time also on engaging with communities with respect to, in our urban design climate workshops, on the kinds of value propositions, the sort of building capacity with respect to sort of engaging citizens on their own terms, not just sort of flying in from above with super scientific information, but really to talk to them about the kinds of issues that they deal with every day and how that fits within a sort of a climate science perspective. And so this is an example of work that we did in Durban, South Africa, just a few months ago, where we essentially learned, we reached out to community groups, got back a lot of the kinds of issues that they're facing, and managed to put a number of these issues into this sort of climate related factors that we're talking about. So this is just a brief example of a sort of relationship between, say, green infrastructure and the kind of climate work that we're doing. There's this happens to be my coffee table at home, where I put this card in the center which talks about green infrastructure, which is, again, a sort of a proxy for access to light and air, because that's very important. And around it are these different colored cards which represent different systems, different different expertise. So you might have the red card is economic development, the orange one is public health, a green one might be something else, and relating those then to the central card. And so this is where the value proposition question comes in, where finding allies and other sort of expertise, funding sources, et cetera, to increase the power of the kind of work that we're proposing here today, to bring this kind of to fruition. And so, everything from regulatory environment to action on the ground at a grassroots level. And finally, at the end of the day, really to describe the kind of work that we do from a quality of life perspective, focusing on social cohesion as a key to resilience, and really sort of developing and enhancing a kind of culture of climate change that would lead us to a culture of sustainability. So I think that's how I'd like to end it. Thank you so much.